There are places built not just to hold men, but to digest them. Blackwood Penitentiary was one of those places. Built in 1892 out of dark, jagged slate and cold iron, it stood on a jagged cliff overlooking a churning, freezing ocean. Inside, the air always smelled of damp concrete, old copper, and rust. But the real horror wasn't the isolation or the brutal guards. It was Cellblock D. In Cellblock D, on the ground floor at the very end of a narrow, dimly lit corridor sat Cell 13. Over 50 years, 21 men had entered Cell 13. None of them had ever left alive, and every single one of them had died at exactly 3:15 a.m. The medical examiner's reports were always identical. Cause of death, acute cardiac arrest. But the crime scene photos told a much darker story. Every victim was found lying on their back, eyes wide open, pupils dilated in total terror, with deep, purple-black bruises around their own necks. It was as if they had reached up with their own hands and choked the life out of themselves while staring at something on the ceiling. The prison administration officially blamed it on a severe form of sleep apnea, combined with sudden heart failure, brought on by stress. But the inmates knew better. They called it the 3:15 curse. They believed that at 3:15 a.m., the devil himself walked through the steel doors of Cell 13. Enter Marcus Vance. Marcus wasn't a real inmate. He was an undercover operative for a specialized federal investigation task force. Externally, his record was painted with bank robberies and aggravated assault, a ruthless criminal persona crafted to fool the most hardened gang leaders inside Blackwood. Internally, Marcus was a master of observation, a trained behavioral psychologist, and a man who did not believe in ghosts. He believed in human malice, greed, and meticulous planning. When the task force noticed that 3 high-profile corporate whistleblowers had all conveniently died in Cell 13 over a 6-month period, they knew it wasn't a curse. It was an impossible murder machine. Marcus's mission was simple yet terrifying. Get transferred into Cell 13, survive the night, and uncover how someone was committing the perfect crime in a locked cell under 24-hour surveillance. The transfer happened on a rainy Tuesday evening. Marcus was escorted down the long, echoing hallway of Cellblock D by Warden Thomas, a tall, imposing man with a silver mustache and eyes as cold as glass. Warden Thomas stopped in front of Cell 13, turned a heavy iron key in the lock, and swung the heavy door open with a loud metallic screech. The warden looked at Marcus with a cold, knowing smile and whispered that he hoped Marcus enjoyed his stay, adding that the cell had a history of making men talk to themselves. Marcus stepped inside, and the iron door slammed shut behind him. The deadbolt clicked into place. The room was cold, barely 6 feet wide and 8 feet long. It contained only a narrow steel cot bolted to the floor, a rusted toilet, and a small high window with thick iron bars that showed nothing but the black, stormy night. Marcus sat on the thin mattress, his mind working in overdrive. He immediately began inspecting every square inch of the room. He checked the iron bars on the window, solid and unyielding. He examined the floorboards, searching for hidden compartments or pipes. He searched the light fixture hanging from the ceiling, a single dim bulb encased in a heavy wire cage. Nothing. There were no hidden doors, no secret passages, no physical way for anyone to enter the cell from the outside without alerting guards or being caught on the hallway camera mounted right outside his door. The hallway camera was pointed directly at Cell 13, recording continuously. Whoever was killing the inmates was doing it while the entire world was watching the door. Yet no one ever saw a killer enter or leave. At 10 p.m., the main lights in the cell block flickered and turned off, leaving only the dim red emergency lights casting long, eerie shadows across the concrete walls. The ambient sound of the prison gradually shifted, the shouting, iron doors slamming, and distant chatter died down, replaced by the ominous symphony of a maximum security prison at night, heavy breathing, quiet sobbing, and the low hum of the ventilation system. Marcus remained awake, sitting upright on his cot with his back against the cold stone wall. He monitored his own pulse, keeping his breathing calm and steady. He knew that psychological terror relied on the target losing control of their own mind. He was determined not to break. By 2 a.m., The temperature inside cell 13 dropped drastically. Marcus could see his own breath forming white clouds in the dim red light. He noticed a faint metallic taste in the back of his throat, similar to copper or a battery placed on the tongue. He rubbed his eyes, realizing his vision was beginning to blur slightly around the edges. Was it exhaustion, or was something else happening? He checked his wristwatch. The glow-in-the-dark hands pointed to 2:45 a.m. The countdown had begun. Marcus stood up and walked around the tiny cell to keep his blood circulating. He noticed that the quiet hum of the air vent above his bed had changed pitch. It was lower now, a deep, vibrating thrum that felt less like a sound and more like a physical pressure against his chest. At 3 a.m., the strange sensations intensified rapidly. Marcus felt an intense wave of nausea hit him like a physical blow. His heart began to race wildly, pounding against his ribs at an alarming speed despite his efforts to stay calm. Then came the hallucinations. Out of the corners of his eyes, the dark shadows in the cell seemed to twist and stretch, forming towering, grotesque figures that moved across the walls. An overwhelming feeling of existential dread washed over him, a primal instinct screaming that he was going to die, that something monstrous was in the room with him. He felt an unbearable pressure in his head, a burning sensation behind his eyes, and an uncontrollable urge to grip his own throat to stop the suffocation. He was suddenly feeling. Marcus sank to his knees, his hands trembling violently. His brain was telling him to panic, to choke, to fight the invisible hands around his neck. But Marcus was a scientist first and a soldier second. He forced himself to analyze what his body was experiencing. The sudden drop in temperature, the metallic taste, the intense, irrational terror, the racing heart, the visual distortions, and the localized physical pressure. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't magic. It was a massive, concentrated dose of infrasound combined with an airborne chemical agent. Infrasound consists of sound waves below the human hearing threshold, usually below 20 Hz. At specific frequencies, particularly around 19 Hz, infrasound causes the human eyeball to vibrate, creating visual hallucinations like shadows or ghost-like figures. More importantly, high-intensity infrasound resonates directly with human internal organs, causing extreme panic, dread, nausea, and a rapid spike in blood pressure that can induce sudden cardiac arrest in a matter of minutes. But infrasound alone couldn't account for the physical bruises on the victims. Next, that required something else, a neurotoxin. Marcus crawled toward the air vent near the ceiling, fighting against the overwhelming terror paralyzing his muscles. He looked up through the wire mesh of the vent. The air coming out smelled faintly of sweet almonds, cyanide, gas derivative mixed with aerosolized scopolamine, a drug known to erase willpower and induce extreme, violent, self-harming behavior under psychological distress. The killer wasn't entering the cell. The killer was using the ventilation system to turn cell 13 into a gas chamber. And sonic weapon testing, ground every night at 3:15 a.m. Looking closer into the dark grating of the vent, Marcus noticed a tiny red light blink once, twice, and then go solid. It was a remote-activated microdispenser integrated into the prison's outdated ductwork, wired directly to the main control room. The timing was automated, controlled by software running on the prison's central server. Whoever designed this system had created a completely automated execution chamber that left no physical trace of forced entry, no outside intruders on camera, and forced the victim's own hands to choke themselves as their brain succumbed to violent muscle spasms caused by the neurotoxin and extreme panic. Marcus looked at his watch, 3:12 a.m. He had less than 3 minutes before his heart would give out under the immense pressure of the infrasound frequency and the accumulating toxins in his bloodstream. He knew he couldn't stop the gas from coming out of the vent, but he could stop the infrasound from destroying his heart rhythm. He needed to disrupt the resonance. Marcus ripped off his prison jumpsuit, tore the thick cotton fabric into strips, and soaked them in the toilet water. He shoved the wet fabric deep into his ears to block the physical vibration of the air pressure, then wrapped the remaining wet cloth tightly over his nose and mouth to act as a crude filter against the chemical gas. He dropped to the concrete floor where the gas concentration was slightly lower, pressing his face against the crack beneath the heavy steel door, where fresh air from the hallway was leaking in. At exactly 3:15 a.m., the ventilation system gave a sharp, high-pitched hiss. A dense, invisible wave of low-frequency sound rocked the room, making the metal cot rattle against the floor. Marcus felt a sharp, blinding pain in his chest as his heart struggled to maintain its rhythm against the sonic assault. Shadows danced wildly in front of his eyes. His hands involuntarily reached toward his throat as his nervous system misfired under the influence of the poison. With every ounce of willpower remaining in his body, Marcus pinned his hands beneath his torso, pressing his chest flat against the cold concrete floor. He bit down hard on his inner lip, using the sharp physical pain to keep his mind grounded and focused. He stared at the red light of the hallway camera, visible through the tiny glass window of his cell door. He held his breath, counting the agonizing seconds in his head. 1, 2, 3, 4. The terror was overwhelming, screaming at him to give up, to let go, to tear at his own skin. 5, 6, 7. Slowly, the hissing sound in the vent began to fade. At 3:18 a.m., the low-frequency vibration shut off automatically. The air in the cell began to clear as the standard exhaust fans kicked in, flushing out the remaining gas to hide the evidence before the morning guard rotation. Marcus lay motionless on the floor, his lungs burning, his body soaked in cold sweat, but his heart was still beating. He had survived 3:15 a.m. He waited until he regained control of his limbs, then slowly pulled the wet rags from his ears and face. He stood up, walked to the heavy iron door, and looked directly into the camera lens with a cold, clear stare. The next morning at 6 a.m., the heavy deadbolt of cell 13 unlatched with a loud clanking noise. Guard Warden Thomas stepped into the cell, holding a clipboard, expecting to find another lifeless body on the cot. Instead, he found Marcus sitting calmly on the bed, holding the micro dispenser device and a small piece of wiring he had managed to pry out of the ventilation, ducked using a hidden metal clip. Marcus looked up at the warden, smiled softly, and handed him the evidence. He told the warden that the game was over, that the remote logs on the central server had already been copied via an external transmitter he had carried inside his boot, and that the federal authorities were currently surrounding the building. There are places in this world designed to strip away your humanity piece by piece. But Iron Ridge Supermax was built to erase you entirely. Constructed deep beneath a barren desert in southern New Mexico, Iron Ridge was an underground labyrinth of reinforced steel and windowless concrete. The upper levels housed high-risk inmates, low-level cartel enforcers, and violent offenders. But 3 levels down, beneath the damp bedrock where the air felt heavy and cold, sat Sublevel 3. It didn't officially exist on any state blueprints. On paper, Sublevel 3 was just a ventilation shaft and a secondary utility matrix. In reality, it was where the state sent people it wanted the world to forget. At the very end of Sublevel 3's dark, dripping corridor was Cell 404. In the digital world, an error 404 means not found. In Iron Ridge, Cell 404 meant you no longer existed. The room was 4 paces wide and 5 paces long, illuminated only by a faint, sickly green neon strip embedded in the ceiling behind shatterproof glass. The walls were painted a dull chipping gray, covered in faint, scratched tally marks from inmates who had long since vanished. The air smelled perpetually of chlorine, heavy ozone, and an underlying metallic stench that tasted like old blood. Cell 404 was supposed to be a punishment cell, a place of isolation for uncooperative prisoners. But the men who were assigned to Cell 404 were never unruly. They were always healthy, young, and possessed rare blood types. Julian Cruz sat on the cold concrete floor of Cell 404, his back pressed against the damp wall. Julian was not a murderer, a mobster, or an armed robber. He was a gray hat hacker, a kid from Chicago who had spent his youth dissecting encrypted networks and bypassing corporate firewalls. Julian's crime was simple yet fatal. He had accidentally breached an off-grid server belonging to a shell corporation tied to high-ranking government officials and international elites before he could go public with what he found. His apartment was raided by federal agents with unmarked black badges. Within 48 hours, his identity was wiped from every public database. His driver's license was revoked, his social security number flagged as deceased, and he was thrown into Iron Ridge under an alias, Inmate 88,204. When Julian was transferred down to sublevel 3, the veteran guards didn't look him in the eye. They moved him with a silent, eerie precision that made his skin crawl. The heavy iron door of cell 404 swung shut behind him with a deafening metallic thud that echoed through his chest. He was told he would be spending 2 weeks in solitary confinement for an alleged rule violation he never committed. But Julian wasn't stupid. He knew how systems worked. Whether they were made of lines of code or concrete and steel, every system had a flaw, every network had an entry point, and every secretive operation left a digital footprint. On his third night in cell 404, Julian noticed something unusual about the faint hum vibrating through the floorboards. Most inmates assumed it was just the ancient HVAC system circulating stale air through the underground complex, but Julian had spent his life analyzing patterns. The vibration wasn't random, nor was it continuous. Every night at precisely 11:30 p.m., the hum changed frequency, dropping into a steady, rhythmic pulse that lasted exactly 4 hours before shutting off at 3:30 a.m. Along with the sound came the faint, distinct smell of medical-grade disinfectant and the low, muffled thud of heavy footsteps moving past his door. Not guard boots, but the soft, rubberized soles of medical personnel. Curiosity eclipsed his fear. Julian began inspecting the cell in complete darkness, using his fingers to map every crack and crevice. Along the floorboards and baseboards, behind the rusted, disused sink near the corner of the room, he felt a slight draft of cold air pushing through a microscopic gap in the masonry. Armed with a sharpened plastic toothbrush handle he had spent hours grinding against the concrete floor, Julian spent 4 painstaking nights scraping away the crumbling mortar behind the pipes. On the 5th night, his tool struck metal. It wasn't concrete or stone behind his wall. It was a hidden conduit box containing a junction of heavy-duty fiber optic data cables and audio-visual wiring that ran through the entire length of sublevel 3. Julian knew that in the modern world, even the most secure underground prisons relied on digital infrastructure for security, access control, and internal communications. He didn't have a laptop, a smartphone, or a keyboard, but he had something better, an intuitive, terrifying understanding of hardware architecture and signal interception. Using a copper wire he pulled from the frame of his bed springs, he carefully stripped a tiny section of the fiber optic shielding, crafting a crude physical bridge to intercept the raw data signals pulsing through the cables. By tapping into the line and using the small digital screen of an old, discarded guard pager he had managed to steal during his initial intake pat-down, Julian began sniffing the prison's internal network packets. What unfolded on that tiny, flickering green screen froze the blood in his veins. Cell 404 was not an isolation cell. It was a holding pen for a black market medical facility hidden directly behind the back wall of sublevel 3. The data streams contained detailed medical profiles, blood work panels, organ compatibility charts, and live auction logs hosted on an encrypted darknet server routing through offshore satellites. Iron Ridge wasn't just a prison designed to keep criminals off the streets. It was a harvest ground. Wealthy international buyers, corrupt politicians, and dying billionaires were paying tens of millions of dollars for fresh, untraceable organs. And the donors were the lost inmates of Iron Ridge. Men whose records could be easily erased. Men whose disappearances could be officially logged as prison riots, suicides, or failed escape attempts. The terrifying realization hit Julian like a sledgehammer. He wasn't in cell 404 because he was being punished. He was in cell 404 because his medical scan during intake had revealed he possessed an extremely rare AB negative blood type. The digital auction log showed that his profile had been uploaded 2 days ago. Bidding had opened at $3 million for his liver and kidney. The auction was set to close at midnight tonight. Once the payment cleared, a medical team would enter cell 404, sedate him, roll him through the hidden passage behind the wall, and harvest his organs. His body would then be incinerated in the prison's underground furnace, leaving no paper trail, no body, and no trace of his existence. Panic surged through Julian's chest, making his heart race violently. He had less than 3 hours before the auction closed and the harvest team came for him. Escaping physically was impossible. The door was solid steel, double-locked from the outside, guarded by armed mercenary guards who answered to Warden Vance. The mastermind behind the lucrative operation, Julian couldn't fight his way out with his fists, nor could he dig a tunnel through 6 feet of reinforced bedrock. His only weapon was the raw, unencrypted data stream pulsing through the copper wire grip between his trembling fingers. He had to hack his way out of a physical death trap. Julian sat in the pitch-black corner of his cell, his eyes fixed on the dim green screen of a modified pager. His fingers moved with lightning speed, tapping out raw terminal commands through the pager's limited 2-button interface. He didn't just need to stop the auction. He needed to burn the entire system to the ground. First, he routed his connection backward through the prison's internal gateway. Bypassing the firewall security protocols, he accessed the warden's private terminal, downloading gigabytes of financial records, offshore bank account details, darknet transaction keys, and video footage of previous surgical procedures conducted in the underground facility. Next, Julian needed a distraction massive enough to breach the prison's physical security. He injected a custom, self-replicating virus into the prison's automated control system. The code acted like a digital wildfire, corrupting every command line in the central server. At 11:45 p.m., 15 minutes before his auction was set to end, the prison's security grid suffered a catastrophic failure across all 5 levels of Iron Ridge Supermax. Every electronic cell door unlocked simultaneously. The emergency sirens began to wail, a deafening, piercing screech that shattered the silence of the underground facility. Red strobe lights flashed through the corridors as automated fire suppression systems triggered, spraying ice-cold water into the cell blocks. Chaos erupted instantly. Hundreds of hardened prisoners, suddenly finding their cell doors wide open, poured out into the hallways. Riots broke out across sublevels 1 and 2 as guards frantically tried to regain control of the facility. Down in sublevel 3, the panic was even greater. The medical team, realizing that the entire security network was compromised, scrambled to destroy their physical files and evacuate the underground surgical suite. Warden Vance rushed into the main server room, his face pale with terror as he watched his private bank accounts being drained in real time, the funds being redistributed into thousands of untraceable public crypto wallets across the globe. But Julian wasn't finished. Using his intercepted line, he initiated a hardwired override command that he had piggybacked onto the main server's emergency response system. He didn't just send the stolen files to local authorities, who might be corrupt or in the warden's pocket. He uploaded the entire database, every medical chart, every darknet auction log, every video file, and every name of the high-profile international buyers direct to the public servers of the FBI's Cyber Division, Interpol, and every major investigative news outlet across the globe simultaneously. The stream was tagged with a high-priority, undeletable broadcast alert that flagged the IP address directly to Iron Ridge Supermax. Outside cell 404, heavy boots thundered down the hallway. Warden Vance himself, holding a silenced pistol and flanked by 2 heavily armed private security guards, kicked open the iron door. Vance's eyes were bloodshot, filled with pure rage as he looked at Julian, who was still sitting in the corner holding the copper wire and the glowing pager. Vance raised the pistol, aiming it directly at Julian's forehead, his voice dripping with venom as he told Julian that he was going to die right here on the concrete floor, virus or no virus. Julian didn't flinch. He slowly looked up at the warden, a cold, calm smile spreading across his face, and told Vance to check his watch. At that exact second, the sound of heavy, high-caliber military helicopters rattled the ceiling of the underground complex. The screeching tires of dozens of armored vehicles echoed from the surface levels above. The federal task force, alerted by the undeletable broadcast stream and accompanied by SWAT teams from 3 different federal agencies, had breached the surface perimeter of Iron Ridge red laser sites, flooded into the corridor of sublevel 3 through the shattered security doors. Federal agents screamed orders, demanding everyone drop their weapons immediately. Vance's guards instantly dropped their rifles, raising their hands in the air. Vance stood frozen, his gun trembling in his hand, realizing that the empire he had built beneath the earth was over. The heavy steel doors of sublevel 3 were thrown wide open as federal officers flooded the hallway, detaining Vance and his team on the spot. Julian slowly stood up, letting the copper wire drop to the floor. He stepped out of cell 404, breathing in the cold desert air that was finally circulating. Through the open doors, the hidden room behind cell 404 was seized, its horrific secrets exposed to the world in a global media firestorm. Dominated headlines for months. Iron Ridge Supermax was shut down permanently, and every official involved in the dark conspiracy was brought to justice. Julian Cruz walked out of the underground hellhole, not as a ghost erased by the system, but as the man who used a single wire to tear down the darkest prison crime in history. Justice is supposed to be blind, but in the state of Blackwood, justice had a price tag. For over 20 years, Judge Arthur Vance sat atop his mahogany bench in the district court like an untouchable monarch. He was a man of cold, calculated precision, immaculate suits, and an iron gavel that dictated the fates of thousands. To the public, he was a ruthless law and order figure who sent criminals away with maximum sentences. But behind closed doors, Vance was the architect of a lucrative shadow business. He took massive kickbacks from private prison conglomerates to keep their cells packed, often framing innocent men, suppressing key evidence, and railroading targeted individuals who stood in his way. Over 2 decades, he built an empire built on stolen lives, ruining innocent families with a single tap of his gavel. His untouchable reign finally shattered not through a federal raid or a brave whistleblower, but through a meticulously orchestrated trap. When Vance was caught red-handed in a massive wiretap operation, receiving a multi-million-dollar bribe, the public scandal was unprecedented. The media demanded blood, and the justice system, eager to save its own reputation, made an example out of him. Judge Arthur Vance was sentenced to 25 years without parole. But the true nightmare wasn't the sentence itself, it was his placement. Through a series of suspicious paperwork transfers and altered transport logs, Vance wasn't sent to a minimum security white-collar facility. He was shipped directly to Blackwood Maximum Security Penitentiary, a brutal, decaying fortress of concrete and barbed wire, and specifically dropped into Cellblock 9, an isolated, off-grid wing known simply as the Cage. When the heavy iron gates of Cellblock 9 slammed shut behind him on his first night, the echo sounded less like steel and more like a casket lid sealing tight. Vance stood in the damp, dimly lit hallway, his designer prison jumpsuit clinging to his trembling frame. The air smelled of rust, stale sweat, and bleach. There were no guards stationed in Cellblock 9. The security cameras were dark, their lenses covered in black spray paint, and the electronic monitoring stations were completely silent. Vance realized with a sickening knot in his stomach that he hadn't just been sent to prison, he had been delivered. From the shadows of the corridor emerged 3 men, walking with slow, deliberate steps. They didn't look like manic, violent thugs. They moved with the quiet, chilling discipline of men who had already served eternity in the dark. Vance recognized their faces instantly, his heart dropping into his stomach as his mind raced back through 2 decades of court transcripts. The first was Marcus Vance, no relation, a brilliant former defense lawyer who had uncovered Vance's corrupt kickback scheme 15 years ago, only to be framed by the judge for jury tampering and sentenced to 20 years. The second was Thomas Bennett, a former construction engineer who refused to sign off on unsafe prison building materials, whom Judge Vance had framed for arson, resulting in a life sentence. The third was Elijah Reed, a quiet man who had served 12 years for an armed robbery he never committed, simply because Judge Vance needed a guilty verdict to satisfy a local political donor. These 3 men didn't kill Vance that night. Instead, they revealed the terrifying reality of Cellblock 9. Years ago, through bribe money, smuggled tools, and complete control of the prison's internal black market, they had quietly purchased Cellblock 9 from corrupt guards who looked the other way. They had turned the abandoned block into an off-grid courtroom. They were the jury, the executioners, and the jailers. For 15 years, they had waited patiently for the man who destroyed their lives to cross their threshold. Now the table was turned. The courtroom was an abandoned mess hall at the end of the block, lit by a single hanging bulb over a crude wooden table. Every single night at midnight, Judge Arthur Vance would be put on trial for one of his past crimes. If he refused to participate, or if his defense was deemed in lie, he would suffer brutal physical tortures designed to mimic the exact duration and pain of the sentences he had illegally handed down. The nightly rituals began immediately. Every evening at 11:55 p.m., the heavy iron door of Vance's cell would unlock automatically. He was forced to walk down the dark corridor into the makeshift courtroom, where Marcus sat at the head table holding a heavy iron pipe like a gavel, flanked by Thomas and Elijah. The trials were agonizingly detailed. Marcus had amassed thousands of pages of original case files, illegal financial receipts, suppressed police reports, and taped confessions that Vance thought had been burned decades ago. They forced the former judge to re-examine every single corrupt decision he had ever made, cross-examining him line by line, forcing him to admit under oath how much money he had accepted to destroy innocent lives. For 3 months, Vance endured the terrifying routine. During the day, he was kept isolated in his freezing cell, fed barely enough to survive, and denied any contact with the outside world. At night, he was forced to relive his sins, standing defenseless before the very men he had condemned. His pristine hands became blistered from forced labor inside the block. His voice rasped from hours of desperate pleading, and his mind began to fray under the psychological weight of his own monstrous past. He tried to appeal to their morality, pleading that he was an old man, that he had learned his lesson, but his arguments fell on deaf ears. They didn't want his remorse. They wanted his absolute submission to true justice. By the 91st night, Vance knew he couldn't survive much longer. His body was failing, his spirit was broken, and he overheard Thomas mentioning that the final verdict trial was scheduled for the end of the week, a trial that would inevitably end in his permanent execution once they finished documenting every single corrupt case file. Vance realized that if he wanted to live, he had to break his own legal golden rule. He had to stop playing by their rules and find a loophole in the physical structure of the cage. He began using his daily brief exercise hours to carefully observe his environment, searching for any weakness in the cell block's perimeter. Vance noticed that while the 3 men had total control over Cell Block 9's interior, they still relied on an old steam heating pipe network that connected to the main administrative building next door. The pipe ran through the back wall of the mess hall, hidden behind a rotting plywood panel that held their massive file collection. The pipe was old, rusted, and carried superheated steam under high pressure. If he could rupture that pipe during the nightly trial, the escaping steam would fill the enclosed room instantly, creating a thermal distraction massive enough to blow open the emergency ventilation hatch near the ceiling, allowing him to escape into the main prison courtyard, where actual state guards were stationed. On the night of his final trial, Vance hit a sharp, heavy iron bolt he had scraped off his bed frame inside his sleeve. He walked into the mess hall at midnight, his head bowed, pretending to be completely broken and resigned to his fate. Marcus slammed his iron pipe on the table, calling the court to order for the final time. The room was heavy with tension. Thousands of stolen case files were stacked neatly across the tables, representing hundreds of innocent lives ruined for profit. Marcus began reading the final charge: the systematic destruction of human lives for financial gain. As Marcus raised his eyes to deliver the final verdict, Vance made his move. Instead of falling to his knees to beg as he had done every night prior, Vance lunged backward toward the plywood wall behind the prosecution table. With all the remaining strength in his frail body, he drove the heavy iron bolt into the rusted seam of the main steam line. The ancient metal split open with a terrifying, deafening crack. High-pressure, scalding steam roared out of the pipe like a furious beast, instantly filling the room with a blinding white cloud of extreme heat and deafening noise. Chaos erupted in an instant. Thomas and Elijah stumbled backward, blinded by the dense steam and burning air. Marcus shouted orders, trying to navigate through the whiteout. but the intense heat forced them toward the exit doors. Vance, knowing the layout by heart after 90 days of intense observation, scrambled through the blinding fog, his skin blistering under the hot vapor. He grabbed a heavy stack of the original physical evidence files from the table, holding them tightly against his chest, and kicked open the rusted latch of the low ventilation hatch near the back wall. He dragged himself through the narrow, hot metal shaft, clawing at the dust and grime until he burst out onto the roof of Cellblock 9. Gasping for the freezing night air, the cold air hit his burned skin like ice. But Vance didn't stop. He scrambled across the roof toward the security perimeter fence, screaming at the top of his lungs for the tower guards. Searchlights swung across the darkness, pinning the former judge in blinding beams of white light. Sirens began to wail across Blackwood maximum security as armed guards rushed the roof with rifles drawn. Vance collapsed onto his knees, raising his hands in the air, holding the thick stack of financial documents high above his head. He screamed that he was a federal prisoner, that he was surrendering, and that he had evidence of a massive illegal operation inside the prison. When the federal authorities and state investigators arrived at Blackwood the following morning, what they discovered shattered the entire state correctional system. Vance didn't just surrender himself to save his own life. He handed over the entire stack of original files he had snatched from the mess hall courtroom. The documents contained infallible proof of 30 years of institutional corruption, detailing every bribe, every rigged trial, every corrupt warden, and every private company involved in the human trafficking scheme that had fueled the state's prison system. The aftermath was a global media earthquake. The investigation, sparked by the recovery of those files, led to the exoneration and immediate release of over 200 wrongfully convicted individuals, including Elijah Reed and Thomas Bennett. Marcus Vance's original conviction was overturned, and he walked out of Blackwood a free man, his name completely cleared in the eyes of the law. The entire administrative staff of Blackwood, along with dozens of high-ranking judges and politicians, were indicted and sentenced to federal prison. As for Arthur Vance, his attempt to escape his private nightmare ultimately backfired in the most poetic way possible. While his exposure of the corruption system reduced his risk of immediate street execution, his own signed confessions, recorded during those 90 midnight trials in Cellblock 9, were admitted as valid state evidence. The court found that every word he uttered in the cage was corroborated by physical evidence. Judge Arthur Vance was resentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Spent the rest of his natural days stripped of his title, his wealth, and his freedom, locked inside a maximum security cell, forced to listen to the distant sound of gavels falling for the rest of his life, permanently trapped inside the very cage he had spent a lifetime building for others.